Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how to install a lift kit on this Land Cruiser. I used a 2.5-inch heavy Old Man Emu lift kit, and I'll walk you through how I did it. I apologize for the audio quality. I actually bought a little stand for the GoPro, but unfortunately it muffled the audio, so I had to do an audio over, almost do the whole thing, so I apologize for that. But as you can see here, it's all done. I actually put KO2s, and I'll show you step by step of what I did. Mostly I'll show you just one side. I only recorded one side, not both sides, just to make it a little easier on me, but they're identical, nothing special between left and right. The only thing is you make sure you have the correct labeled torsion bar, left hand or right hand. That's the only difference, and they're labeled properly, and it's pretty easy to do. But, thank you for watching, and hope you guys enjoy the video. Before you do start, you want to see how much of a lift you actually get. So you want to measure from the middle of the hub to the top of the fender on all four sides, and then write your number down. That way you realize how high you go. For mine, you can see on the screen here momentarily, I did all four, and then I'll show you later at the end of the install what they are and how much of lift I actually gained. Alright guys, we're in the back of the Land Cruiser. I'm supporting the frame using the two jack stands, and I'm also supporting the axle using two smaller jack stands to assist in removal of the rear coil and the shock. Alright, let's get started. First thing you got to do is remove these two 12mm bolts on both sides of the sway bar links to help remove the coil and the shock. We'll do the same thing to the other side to drop the sway bar link to the floor. This next step is to remove the shock from the rear. You can kind of see, I apologize for the poor lighting and the poor angle, but the very top of that is a 22mm nut, and you need to be able to remove that. And it is kind of difficult because of the tight space. So you will need a 22mm socket wrench just like this here. You have to put it up top and turn it. You might not be able to turn it without the shock turning, so you'll have to use kind of a small set of vice grips or something to hold the shock as you turn, kind of like this. And once you do get that and it breaks loose, it becomes much easier to be able to hold the shock and turn the nut. This took me about 10 to 15 minutes, so it is a slow process. You have to go very slow, very patiently, turning little by little, but it is possible to get it out without any other tools or any other special way to remove it. Just take your time and don't get frustrated. It will come out. Next step is to remove the lower shock bolt from the shock itself using a 17mm socket wrench. Mine was a little difficult. I used some PB Blaster. It took me a few minutes, but I was finally able to get it loose. Same thing for the other side. The next difficult thing was removing the actual shock itself. I tried to raise the axle, lower the axle, but nothing seemed to help. It was kind of difficult to remove the shock once the bolt was out. I ended up removing this 14mm nut up here, and that finally gave me enough access to be able to remove the shock from the car itself. Able to finally muscle that shock out, but not before I hurt myself. But not a big deal. I'm used to hurting myself all the time. And then using the leverage of my body, I was able to remove the coil pretty easily, just pushing down on the axle. I am 6'3", 200 plus pounds, so maybe that did help. But it wasn't as hard as I imagined. It took me maybe one try and 10 seconds to finally remove it out of the way. After doing one side, you want to go to the other side. I didn't record it because it was much easier to not record it, but it took me maybe 50% less time to remove the other side. And then
Now it's time to put it back together, at least the rear. It comes from the factory without this bushing inside its little hole, so you have to find a way to put it in there. And I thought I can do it at home with the tools I had, and unfortunately it took me a long time to finally figure out I couldn't do it. So I had to go borrow someone else's table vice grip in order to be able to install that. Again, all right, here it is. I have it the way it comes from the factory. I'm removing this metal piece that holds it together, and I'm going to try to put this bushing through that hole one more time. I had to borrow someone else's table grip. I obviously can't put it on my table, so I have to figure out a way to do it without drilling holes on my table. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, but I did figure out a way to put it on the floor and do it. But before I can do that, I make sure I had some all-purpose grease in the bushing and around to make it easier for me. With the small table grip on the floor, I put my foot down, put the bushing inside, and kind of spaced it in, and then slowly pushed the bushing in. It took me about maybe 15 seconds, and finally, after an hour and a half of trying, it was finally in. So you put the flat washer with the flat side down, then the spacer, and then the gold looking thing with washer with the ridges facing up. Then goes the body of the car. Then it goes another bushing the opposite direction with the little indents facing down, a spacer, and then the washer. And then on top of that, the nut goes in there, a 22 millimeter nut. Now you're ready to install everything back together. You got the coils, the flat side, the flattest part should be facing up. And it's actually pretty easy if you jack up the opposite side and you support it. You can kind of see it on the right hand side. I'm supporting the other side with a small jack, and it becomes pretty easy to install that coil. Once it's in this place, you want to check the fitment, make sure the top is flush, and you want to make sure the bottom it's coiled all the way to a small stop, and that way you know it's in correctly. Happy with the coil in, then you get the shock and put it right back in the same spot with the upper part going in first and then the lower part with the bolt. I realized that I needed to raise the suspension a little bit before I can actually put it in there. So this is what you see me do here, is raise the suspension up a couple of inches, and then it was able to fit in with no problem, and I slid the bushing through. I used some blue Loctite on there, and then I hand threaded in and secured it to 98 pounds using the torque wrench. On the other side now, putting the shock together, not much space, and I apologize for the poor lighting, but we got to put the gold washer in reverse, then the spacer, and then the silver washer seated just like that on top of the spacer, and then comes the nut. You can try to put your hand in there and try to hand thread it as much as possible. I think I got a couple turns before I had to actually start using the wrench.
Hey guys, my GoPro died last night, so I wasn't able to show you guys how I put the back end back together. So let me quickly walk you through it. And I put the sway bar links back in yesterday. What you do is you raise one side, and then you put the two bolts halfway in, and on the other side, and then you swap. You raise the other side, and then put these two bolts halfway in, and then you drop it all, and then you hand tighten all four of the bolts. I got a torque wrench for the lower bolt for the shock. It's 98 pounds on both sides. As you can see, it looks pretty good. The springs and the shocks. I drove it around for a minute and it looks great.
So now we're in the front of the car. You can see my son actually helped me out for about 5 minutes, and then he got bored on one side. But as you can see, I held up the car using the jacks. I removed the skid plate that's up there with the 12mm bolts. It's about 6 of them, and there's one in the middle that removes the whole skid plate. And then behind the skid plate is some plastic guard, and that needs to be removed too, using 12mm to access the torsion bars. With everything out of the way now you're free to be able to remove the torsion adjustment bolt using a 30mm socket wrench. I tried with just the normal half-inch drive, but I was unable to turn it, so I had to use a homemade breaker bar there that my son helped me, and you can see it just kind of slid over that, and with some pressure I was able to loosen it up enough to remove the torsion bar. After a lot of spinning, it finally fell to the ground. Now you go to the front, and there's two nuts that hold the front arm of the torsion bar, and these required a lot of pressure to release these. So I used that breaker bar again on both sides and apply a lot of pressure, and I was finally able to release them. Same thing with the other side. With that loose, now you can remove the torsion bar. I had to use a rubber mallet and hit it a couple times. It wasn't as seized up as I thought. Once again, you can use some PB Blaster or some WD-40 to loosen it up, but I hit it a couple times and I was able to loosen it up. It's got two bolts, one long one from the other side of the axle and a small one that you can't really access. So as long as you pull the long one out, the short one will be easily removed once you pull the whole torsion bar towards the rear. Now once you're able to remove the torsion bar with the anchor out of the bolts, then you have to remove that anchor arm. As you can see here, I just pounded it with a mallet and I was able to loosen it up and remove it. Now you go to the back part of the torsion bar, and that was the most difficult thing to remove for me. I had to use PB Blaster and let it sit there for about 20 to 30 minutes and try 3 or 4 or 5 times until I was finally able to loosen it up. But it did take me a while. I'm not sure why. The other side wasn't as difficult, but this side was. Just be patient and use as much PB Blaster as you need. After maybe 20 minutes of trying, I was finally able to let it loose. Unfortunately, I turned the GoPro off for a second there to save some battery. But the way I did it is by turning the torsion bar towards the inner part of the car and hitting it with a mallet, and it finally came loose. All right, the last thing we have to remove now is the front shock on both sides. Once you remove the torsion bar, this part should be pretty easy. There is a nut 22mm up top up there, and that needs to be loosened up. Unfortunately, there's nothing to grab on besides the very tip of the shock, so you have to use some kind of vice grip or something to be able to bite that in order to turn the 22mm and be able to remove that. And then you want to go below and remove the lower bolt, not the nut, from the lower part of the shock. The top nut is out, then you want to remove the bolt. This bolt was the most difficult bolt in the entire car to remove. It required a lot of patience and a lot of time to remove it. And you can see it moves the entire suspension up. And I was finally, after honestly maybe 15 minutes of trying to take this out, it finally broke loose, and I was able to remove it and then reinstall the shock. Now you want to put some weight on the front part of the hub, push gently down, and it just slid right out with no problem. Now to install it, you want to build it up the same way you did in the back. You want to put the flat washer in first, followed by the spacer, then the gold-plated one with the little ridges up. Then you want to slide it in. I kept the shipping harness in there until I was able to put it in the slot, and then I removed it. With the help of a flathead screwdriver, I was able to lift the shock just enough to be able to put the bolt in and hand tighten it. After you put the bolt all the way back in through the nut on the other side, then you want to make sure it's tightened to 98 on the torque wrench to 98 pounds. Next, you want to install the nut. This is probably the easiest part of the whole install. There's a space right there where the yellow is to put a 19mm wrench, and then you put a 22 wrench up top, millimeter wrench up top, and it's fairly quick and easy to secure the nut to the shock. Now to set up for install, you want to mark the splines. I use a tire marker and the straight ruler, and I backed it up with the string. For the right one, you want to mark it and then go on the other side and mark 5 clockwise. And I use a string like you see here to measure. That was accurate. And then with the left one, you want to do mark one side, and you want to do counterclockwise for the left one. It should be labeled left and right hand from the manufacturer. So do not mess that up. Use the left hand on the left side, use the right hand on the right hand side. Now for the forward and back arm, you want to label which side is the driver's side or the passenger side, or left and right, however you want to do it. And there's a space inside where there is no spline. It's like an empty space, and you want to mark it on every single one. And mark it on both sides. That way you can easily see. And once you've done that, then you want to put some all-purpose grease inside all 4 cavities to make sure it's able to go in and out with no problem. As you can see, my helper left, so I was left to my own devices here. I had to find a way to jimmy the torsion bar all the way to one side, so I went back and forth a lot. But make sure you line up the splines correctly to both marks you made on the arm and on the torsion bar. You can see myself, I'm moving it here and position itself, and then you position it on one side. And once you do get it in, kind of push it in as far in as you can, and then swap positions and go to the other side. I had a little trouble here with this one because with the grease, I kind of lost the marking on one of the splines, so I had to go and clean that up just a little bit so I can see which spline went exactly into which section. And after a couple seconds of fussing around, I was able to put it in its right location. Once I seated the rear arm into the torsion bar, I went to the front and I did the same thing, make sure it lined up correctly into the arm bracket on the right place where I marked the spline. On that one, I didn't mark the other end. I marked the end that went against the frame and not the end that goes against the torsion bar. So I had to go and remark it and make sure I was in the right location. And then I was able to position the bolts through and put the nuts on with no problem after that. So nuts are in. Make sure you torque them down to 166 pounds on each nut, and there's 4 of them. Once the front is tight and the back is all set up, now it's time to adjust that torsion bar bolt. Kind of slide it in, make sure it's all seated kind of like the way you found it. Take a picture before you remove it if you need to, but then slowly hand tighten it as much as you can with the hands, and then use the 30mm socket wrench to do it. Doesn't have to be precise. You're going to have to drop the vehicle down a couple times to get the look you want and raise it up again a couple times. So just tighten it to where you thought you had it when you removed it. Doesn't have to be exact, and it's going to take a slow process. But right now you're not trying to level your truck perfectly. You're just trying to put that in there and install it to a point where then later on you can re-raise your vehicle and then tighten it up again.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. I appreciate it. Hopefully you guys got some good tips and are able to do your own lift kit at home. Just make sure you use good quality jack stands, and safety should be a concern, your first concern actually, when you lift up the vehicle like this. As you can see, the car is lifted up. I did 2.5 inches. I did write down the difference though. It's actually around 3 inches overall. And I'll put it here on the video somewhere with the actually lifted. And it's 3 inches only because I got the heavy kit and I have yet to install the bumper, either side, or the roof rack. So as I add on, more than likely it'll settle to 2.5 inches. But right now I'm pretty happy with the way it looks. Very different than stock. Have any questions, have any comments, right below. Thanks for watching.